September 17th, 1944, northern Leyte, Philippines. The sun had barely pierced the dense canopy when an unnatural roar split the morning air. A low, rolling thunder, unnatural and mechanical, shook the trembling palms. Japanese soldiers, hardened by years of jungle warfare, crouched behind mangrove roots and tangled undergrowth, their rifles trembling and hands slick with sweat. Smoke coiled like serpents between the trees, and the distant whine of engines promised a horror they had never encountered. Moments later, a massive orange firestorm surged forward, devouring trees, vines, and brush with terrifying precision. Men who had survived artillery barrages, sniper ambushes, and relentless patrols now found themselves staring into a wall of fire that moved as if alive. Their shouts were swallowed by the roar, radios crackled with confusion, and for the first time, the jungle seemed to fight back against them. It was a new weapon, a new form of terror. The Americans had brought napalm, and the Japanese soldiers couldn't fathom how an entire forest could vanish in a single, fiery sweep. The ground quaked as planes made low passes, dropping their incendiary payloads with surgical accuracy, each explosion punctuating the horror like drumbeats in a nightmare symphony. Trees splintered, their leaves igniting instantly, and the heat pressed down, blistering skin even from a distance. From their foxholes, Japanese soldiers tried to regroup, shouting orders that were lost in the crescendo of destruction, their disciplined formations crumbling before their eyes. The forest, once a fortress of shadows and hidden paths, became a molten gauntlet. Smoke obscured the horizon, glowing embers floated like fiery ghosts, and the air itself carried the acrid stench of burning timber and flesh. The sheer scale of the destruction left them disoriented. They had trained for ambushes, for hand-to-hand combat, and for mortars and machine guns. But this was a weapon that consumed everything without regard, that turned the protective jungle into a furnace. Commands issued by officers dissolved into panic. Squads scattered, seeking cover where none existed. The Americans, by contrast, flew in disciplined patterns above the chaos, their B-25 bombers and P-38s coordinating with ground units who had perfected the timing of napalm drops. Firefights erupted in places where no enemy had yet been found, because the fire itself became the battlefield. The roar of gasoline-fueled flames was accompanied by a mechanical symphony of engines, radios, and artillery, each element synchronized to ensure maximum devastation. Japanese soldiers tried to use their traditional strategies, camouflage, stealth, and entrenched positions. Yet the napalm spread relentlessly, turning rivers into lines of fire and clearing entire stretches of forest in minutes. Smoke choked their lungs, eyes watered, and the once familiar terrain became a hall of mirrors where every movement was tracked by an unseen and merciless force. Amid the chaos, Japanese officers attempted to make sense of reports coming in from their units. Entire regiments had been obliterated, bunkers incinerated, and supply lines cut. They could not reconcile their intelligence with what they witnessed. The forests, which they had relied upon for concealment and ambush, were now exposed, burned, and lifeless. Communications faltered as radios overheated and cables melted, leaving isolated pockets of soldiers stranded in the middle of a fiery inferno. Survivors later recounted the surreal, almost supernatural precision of the attacks. Trees didn't just burn. They ignited in a wave that moved as if guided by unseen hands. Every napalm strike seemed calculated to hunt down hiding soldiers, to root out the last vestiges of resistance. And as the day wore on, the jungle became an alien landscape of charred trunks and smoldering roots. The sun itself seemed dimmed by smoke, casting an eerie red glow over the battlefield, turning the nightmare into an almost hallucinatory vision. In the aftermath, Japanese patrols reported the devastation in disbelief. Entire defensive positions had disappeared overnight, leaving no cover, no shelter, and no sense of control. Soldiers who survived the initial blast were forced to retreat through open ground, vulnerable to American artillery and small arms fire. The psychological impact was immediate. Fear replaced strategy, chaos replaced coordination, and an understanding dawned that the Americans had harnessed a force that did not merely kill but annihilated. As historians would later note, This was a turning point in jungle warfare. The psychological weight of napalm went far beyond its physical destruction. Japanese soldiers, long trained in the tactics of camouflage and patience, found themselves vulnerable to a weapon that ignored terrain and human ingenuity. Even seasoned commanders admitted later, in fragmented diaries and intercepted communications, that they had never seen anything like it. The Orange Inferno became a symbol of a modern war that was not just fought with bullets and shells, but with fire and the terrifying ingenuity of American engineering. Amid the smoke and chaos, the human stories emerged, soldiers carrying wounded comrades through flames, officers making impossible decisions under the roar of destruction, and the ordinary fear that gripped men whose previous training had failed to prepare them for a battlefield where forests themselves became a weapon against them. Beyond the immediate horror, American troops quickly adapted to the terrain, coordinating air strikes and ground movements with unprecedented speed. Forward observers guided the napalm drops, using maps, radios, and visual markers to ensure that the fire swept through targeted areas while avoiding friendly positions. The result was a calculated, devastating efficiency that compounded Japanese confusion. Each successive drop was more than a weapon, it was a statement. The forests that had long shielded Japanese movements and provided strategic advantage were now obliterated. The psychological edge the Americans gained was immeasurable. Soldiers advanced with confidence, knowing the enemy's hiding places had been purged. Japanese resistance faltered, small groups became isolated, and entire units surrendered or fled. Napalm was no longer simply a fire. It was an instrument of control. As the day turned into night, the battlefield glowed with an unholy light. Fires continued to burn, and the silhouettes of American soldiers moving through cleared paths created stark contrasts against the orange haze. The landscape had been rewritten. The jungle, once an ally to the defenders, now offered no refuge. Commanders on both sides recognized that this new tactic demanded an entirely different approach. The effectiveness of napalm went beyond destruction. It altered the psychology of combat. Japanese soldiers had to confront the fact that they could no longer rely on natural cover, that every tree could be incinerated and every position targeted with surgical precision. The terror was amplified by unpredictability. The fire spread quickly, unpredictably, consuming some areas while leaving others untouched, forcing the enemy to constantly move, adapt, and fear the unseen. Casualties mounted, not only from the flames but also from disorientation, stampedes, and exposure. Entire regiments reported catastrophic losses, while American units advanced with measured coordination, exploiting the confusion. In reports sent back to headquarters, officers described the shock among Japanese troops, disbelief, panic, and the realization that their traditional jungle tactics were no longer viable. The Americans had introduced a weapon that redefined the battlefield. It was not merely explosive, it was transformative. By the end of the engagement, entire forests were cleared, positions destroyed, and the psychological impact etched into the minds of every survivor. Japanese soldiers who had spent years mastering jungle warfare were forced to confront a terrifying new reality. The forest was no longer a sanctuary, and fire could strike with surgical precision, reshaping the very nature of combat. Commanders noted the need to rethink tactics, while American forces began to understand the full potential of this weapon, a combination of speed, coordination, and sheer destructive power that rendered traditional defensive strategies obsolete. The implications were immediate and profound. The battlefield had changed, forever altered by the terrifying efficiency of napalm, and a new chapter in the story of warfare had begun. The Japanese could only watch, in disbelief and horror, as the jungle they had called home became a tomb of flames, and the Americans moved forward, unstoppable, leaving devastation and a lesson in modern war that would echo for decades. WWII late 1944, the Pacific Theater had reached a critical juncture. The Japanese Empire, once an unstoppable force across Southeast Asia, was beginning to feel the pressure of American industrial might and strategic ingenuity. Leyte, a verdant island of thick jungles and mangrove swamps, had been chosen by the Allies as the launching point for the liberation of the Philippines. The dense forests, steep ridges, and hidden waterways were thought to be natural fortresses, perfectly suited for Japanese defensive tactics honed over years of island warfare. Their soldiers had become experts in guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Camouflage was second nature. Every leaf, every branch, and every fold in the earth could conceal a sniper or an entire squad. Yet, despite their mastery of jungle warfare, the broader strategic situation painted a grim picture. By this stage, 1944, the Japanese Navy had been shattered at Leyte Gulf, crippling their ability to resupply troops or maneuver reinforcements effectively. Meanwhile, American forces, flush with the momentum of victories in the Marianas and New Guinea, were rapidly advancing, bringing with them a combination of overwhelming firepower, technological innovation, and logistics that would strain the Japanese command to breaking point. Commanders on both sides understood the stakes. For Japan, holding Leyte was crucial. It was the gateway to defending the Philippine archipelago, which, in turn, protected the southern approaches to the home islands. For the Americans, Leyte represented the first step in a chain of operations designed to sever Japanese supply lines, weaken morale, and establish airfields critical for the eventual assault on Okinawa and, ultimately, Japan itself. The theater of operations was unique. Unlike the arid deserts of North Africa or the open fields of Europe, the Pacific jungles posed complex challenges. The heat was relentless, humidity hung in the air like a heavy blanket, and sudden torrential rains could transform trails into impassable mudslides. Japanese soldiers thrived in this environment, using it as a natural shield, while American troops had to adapt quickly, learning to move with precision and discipline in terrain that was as much an enemy as the Japanese themselves. Command doctrines reflected this reality. Japanese military strategy emphasized entrenchment, surprise attacks, and attrition. Each hill, river, and grove was a potential trap. Defenders would allow the enemy to advance, drawing them into kill zones carefully prepared with hidden machine gun nests, artillery, and natural choke points. Conversely, American doctrine had evolved over the early years of the war. Island-hopping campaigns demanded coordinated assaults that integrated infantry, armor, artillery, and, increasingly, air support. The concept of combined arms warfare became critical. Engineers and planners realized that conventional frontal assaults in dense jungles were not only costly but also often ineffective. Success depended on synchronization, timing air strikes, artillery barges, and ground maneuvers to overwhelm the enemy at precise moments. The introduction of innovative weapons like flamethrowers, demolition charges, and, crucially, napalm represented the culmination of lessons learned from previous battles such as Tarawa and Saipan. These weapons were designed to neutralize the Japanese advantage in concealment and entrenchment. As American troops moved through the jungles of Leyte, their presence was informed not merely by brute force, but by calculated application of firepower to manipulate the terrain itself. The dense canopy that Japanese soldiers relied upon for cover became a vulnerability when met with aerial incendiary strikes. The forests that had concealed hidden pillboxes and snipers were now exposed to a weapon that could penetrate the natural defenses with unprecedented effectiveness. In these operations, the psychological dimension of warfare was as critical as the physical. Japanese commanders were confronted with an enemy that did not simply engage in combat, but reshaped the battlefield to its advantage. Reports from field units highlighted a recurring theme. Entire forested sections were rendered impassable or lethal through coordinated use of napalm and conventional explosives. Morale suffered as soldiers realized that the jungle, once a source of strategic confidence, had become a liability. American soldiers, by contrast, gained not only a tactical advantage but also a psychological edge. They witnessed forests ignite in controlled waves, clearing paths, exposing hidden positions, and forcing enemy troops into vulnerable zones. The combination of technology, planning, and precision created an operational tempo that the Japanese could neither anticipate nor counter effectively. From a logistical perspective, the Americans benefited from the industrial might that defined their war effort. Leyte was supplied by an intricate network of ships, trucks, and airdrops, ensuring that troops were not only armed with the latest weapons, but also supported with continuous reinforcements and supplies. In contrast, Japanese units were increasingly isolated. Naval losses, the destruction of supply convoys, and the inability to maneuver reinforcements rendered many garrisons effectively stranded. They had to rely on preposition stockpiles, which were quickly consumed, leaving them exposed to the relentless pressure of American attacks. Command communications added another layer of complexity. American units operated with coordinated radio networks, allowing for rapid adjustments in tactics and immediate responsiveness to unfolding battlefield conditions. Japanese units, constrained by limited and often unreliable communication lines, struggled to maintain cohesion under the stress of rapid, high-intensity engagements. The result was a widening gap between planning and execution, further eroding the defensive capabilities of Japanese forces. Leadership played a defining role in the unfolding drama. American officers emphasized initiative, flexibility, and integration of new technologies into combat operations. Japanese officers, bound by rigid doctrine and facing overwhelming odds, were forced to improvise, often under conditions that negated their most trusted tactics. This clash of strategic philosophies, played out amid the unforgiving jungle, underscored the broader dynamics of the Pacific War: innovation and adaptability versus tradition and resilience. In the months leading to the Napalm deployments, intelligence reports and reconnaissance had confirmed that Japanese defensive networks were extensive. They had constructed intricate bunkers, camouflaged machine gun nests, and interconnected trails that allowed rapid movement across the dense terrain. Yet, even the most carefully prepared defenses could not withstand the disruptive power of the new incendiary strategy. Reconnaissance flights documented the extent of the forests and identified key strongpoints, while engineers and tactical planners devised methods to exploit every vulnerability. This careful preparation contrasted starkly with the traditionalist mindset of Japanese forces, whose reliance on natural concealment now became a fatal weakness. The historical context of Leyte, therefore, was one of tension between two opposing forces: one, adaptive, technologically equipped, and industrially backed; the other, disciplined, resourceful, but increasingly cornered by the changing nature of warfare. The stage was set for the dramatic introduction of a weapon that would not only alter the physical landscape, but also redefine the psychological contours of jungle combat. Napalm, in this context, was not an isolated innovation. It was the logical evolution of strategic thinking, aimed at neutralizing the entrenched advantages of an enemy who had long been thought untouchable in their environment. It represented a fusion of engineering, tactical foresight, and operational audacity. The Japanese soldiers' disbelief at the scale and precision of the incendiary strikes was therefore rooted not merely in the immediate horror, but in a fundamental mismatch of strategy, doctrine, and technological capacity. What they had relied upon for decades, the protective, concealing jungle, was no longer a sanctuary. The historical backdrop of the Pacific in 1944 thus illuminates the broader significance of the events at Leyte, a turning point in which American ingenuity, industrial strength, and tactical innovation converged to challenge, disrupt, and ultimately dismantle a defensive paradigm that had defined Japanese warfare across countless islands and campaigns. In this theater, survival was dictated not solely by courage or training, but by the ability to adapt to a radically transformed battlefield, where fire, coordination, and technology dictated the tempo of conflict, and where the familiar landscapes of home and jungle alike could be consumed in moments, leaving only ashes and the lessons for those who witnessed it. The weapon that would shatter the Japanese perception of jungle warfare was more than a mere chemical. It was a manifestation of American ingenuity, precision, and strategic foresight. Napalm, a sticky, gelatinous incendiary compound, had been engineered to burn hotter, stick to surfaces, and spread unpredictably across foliage, creating a lethal wave that no conventional defense could withstand. Soldiers on Leyte had seen flamethrowers and mortars, but the napalm strike was something entirely different. From the air, American bombers released canisters with methodical timing. They did not simply drop ordnance. They sculpted fire. Thick, orange tongues erupted across the jungle floor, consuming everything in their path, licking up trees and underbrush, and igniting the hidden tunnels and bunkers where Japanese troops had taken refuge. The effect was surgical. Entire swathes of forest vanished as if the land itself had been set ablaze, leaving behind skeletal trunks and blackened soil. Japanese soldiers, trained to rely on natural cover and concealment, found themselves exposed. Their foxholes, once safe havens, became death traps as fire crawled relentlessly along the ground. The psychological impact was immediate. The enemy could not comprehend how a forest, a living, breathing entity they had relied upon for defense, could be erased with such speed and precision. Radio intercepts later captured in intelligence files reveal frantic Japanese communications, officers shouting orders that went unheard over the roar of flames. Units scattered in panic and desperate attempts to regroup in areas already engulfed by fire. The hidden advantage was not merely in the firepower itself, but in its integration with American tactical doctrine. Coordinated air-ground operations ensured that every strike amplified the effectiveness of infantry movements. Forward observers guided the incendiary attacks, marking targets with precision flares and smoke signals. Troops moved through cleared corridors, taking positions that had been stripped of enemy concealment while remaining safe from the uncontrolled spread of fire. This synergy of technology and strategy created a dynamic battlefield in which Japanese soldiers were forced to react to threats they could not predict or counter. Unlike traditional artillery, which required visual confirmation of targets and relied on explosive force to dislodge entrenched enemies, napalm transformed the very environment. Trees, shrubs, and natural fortifications were not merely damaged, they were obliterated. Entire defensive networks were neutralized without a single shot fired by ground troops in some sectors. The Japanese had prepared extensively for American assaults. Trenches, tunnels, and camouflaged bunkers had been reinforced with ingenuity, anticipating indirect artillery and small arms fire. Yet napalm bypassed these defenses entirely. It adhered to surfaces, penetrated narrow openings, and generated heat that made even the most fortified positions untenable. Soldiers recount the surreal horror of seeing their shelters, once considered safe, ignite as if by invisible hands. The combination of aerial mobility and chemical engineering created an operational surprise that left Japanese commanders scrambling. Traditional reconnaissance failed to predict the scale and precision of napalm strikes. Observers could see smoke rising from distant drops, but the speed with which entire forested areas were cleared exceeded all calculations. Units attempting to retreat were caught in lethal crossfires of fire and conventional arms, compounding casualties and deepening confusion. Equally important was the American mastery of timing and sequencing. Napalm drops were not arbitrary. They were carefully coordinated with infantry advances, artillery barges, and diversionary maneuvers. In one documented instance, a B-25 squadron executed a wave of strikes that swept through a ridge, creating a scorched path for advancing troops. Japanese defenders, expecting a more predictable attack, were forced into open ground where they could be neutralized with minimal risk to American forces. The disbelief of Japanese soldiers stemmed not only from the destructive capability but also from the psychological orchestration of the battlefield. Commanders noted the eerie coordination. Fires would flare in sequence, cutting off avenues of retreat, driving troops toward kill zones, and creating the illusion of omnipresent forces. Every movement, every adjustment in American strategy was amplified by the relentless advance of fire. Engineers, scientists, and field officers had collaborated to ensure that napalm was delivered efficiently and effectively. The compound itself, a mixture of gasoline and thickening agents, allowed for adhesion to foliage, a slow burn that intensified the heat, and consistency that made aerial deployment reliable. Factories across the United States churned out thousands of canisters, while logistical teams ensured that these incendiaries reached forward airstrips and carriers for rapid deployment. For Japanese intelligence, the surprise was compounded by a lack of precedent. No previous conflict had witnessed a weapon that could so fundamentally alter terrain and neutralize entrenched defenders with such efficiency. Unit reports frequently mentioned disbelief, with officers questioning whether such destruction could result from a single strike. Traditional anti-aircraft measures were ineffective. The speed, altitude, and precision of American aircraft, combined with the persistent threat of napalm, rendered conventional countermeasures nearly obsolete. The hidden advantage was therefore both technological and doctrinal. The Americans did not simply possess a new weapon. They had integrated it into a system of warfare that maximized its potential while minimizing risks to their own troops. Japanese units, by contrast, found their tactical doctrines obsolete. Entrenchment, camouflage, and familiarity with terrain provided no defense against fire that moved like liquid steel, consuming everything it touched. In battlefield diaries recovered after the war, Japanese soldiers described the surreal sensation of watching entire tree lines vanish, of the air itself seeming to ignite, and of an enemy that appeared to operate with a near-prescient understanding of their positions. The consequence was a collapse of traditional confidence. Troops who had endured artillery, machine guns, and night assaults were now confronted by a weapon that defied their training and intuition. Commanders struggled to issue orders, as lines of communication faltered under the combined stress of fire, smoke, and chaos. From the American perspective, the integration of napalm into jungle operations was a culmination of lessons learned across the Pacific campaigns. Previous battles had exposed the limitations of conventional assaults against fortified terrain. Engineers and tacticians recognized that altering the battlefield itself, clearing forests, flushing out defenders, and creating maneuverable paths, would reduce casualties and enhance operational tempo. Napalm, as both a psychological and physical weapon, provided exactly that advantage. Its effectiveness was amplified by the training and discipline of American forces. Pilots, forward observers, and infantry units had rehearsed the coordination required to exploit each drop fully. The result was not merely destruction but the creation of opportunities, allowing American forces to control the pace and direction of engagement in a theater that had previously favored defenders. The Japanese realization of this hidden advantage came too late to adapt effectively. Units that attempted to reposition were trapped by fire. Counterattacks were stifled before they could develop momentum, and command cohesion disintegrated under the stress of an environment now dominated by American technology and tactics. The shock of witnessing entire forests vanish in moments became emblematic of the broader transformation of warfare in the Pacific. Napalm was no longer simply an incendiary, it was a force multiplier, a tool that redefined the possibilities of combined arms operations, and a stark demonstration of how innovation, coordination, and industrial capacity could overwhelm even the most seasoned defenders. By the time Japanese forces began to comprehend the magnitude of the threat, the advantage had already been decisively exploited. The battlefield had been reshaped, and with it, the psychological and operational equilibrium had shifted irreversibly. In Leyte, the jungle no longer protected the Japanese. It revealed them. In its fiery wake, American forces gained not only territory but also insight into the future of warfare. The decisive role of technology, coordination, and the ability to control both terrain and morale. The engineering behind napalm was as precise as it was terrifying. At first glance, it seemed a simple chemical, a sticky, flammable gel designed to ignite upon contact. But beneath its seemingly crude exterior lay a sophisticated innovation of science and industry. The compound consisted of a mixture of gasoline and a thickening agent, usually a derivative of aluminum salts combined with naphthenic and palmitic acids, creating a gel that clung to surfaces instead of merely burning off. This sticky consistency ensured that it adhered to trees, foliage, and even human skin, producing temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire could not be extinguished with water, and its slow burn maximized both physical destruction and psychological terror. Factories across the United States, from Detroit's industrial heart to the chemical plants in New Jersey, churned out thousands of pounds of napalm. Production involved exacting quality control. Canisters had to withstand aerial deployment without premature detonation, release their payload precisely, and burn predictably to maximize coverage. Engineers designed bombs ranging from 5-gallon incendiary cylinders to larger, 75-gallon aerial dispensers, ensuring flexibility for jungle, urban, and fortification targets alike. Precision was critical. Each B-25 Mitchell or P-38 Lightning carrying napalm had to maintain exact altitude, speed, and trajectory to achieve maximum dispersal upon impact. The canisters, often encased in steel shells, were designed to rupture midair, showering the target in burning gel. The physics of deployment were calculated meticulously. Air resistance, terminal velocity, and wind patterns were factored into bombing runs. A level of sophistication that combined chemistry, aerodynamics, and operational planning into a singular, devastating system. American ingenuity did not stop at the chemical formulation. Ground units incorporated flamethrowers that used a smaller, portable variant of napalm for bunker-clearing missions, extending the utility of the compound beyond aerial deployment. Soldiers trained rigorously, understanding how to manage fuel lines, nozzle pressure, and ignition mechanisms under combat conditions. In the humid jungles of Leyte, even small variations in temperature and wind could drastically alter the behavior of fire, making training and technical understanding indispensable. By contrast, Japanese forces had no equivalent. Their anti-aircraft capabilities could not neutralize the speed and precision of American bombers. Traditional fire suppression techniques, such as bucket brigades or sand, were utterly ineffective against sticky, high-temperature gel that clung to surfaces and consumed oxygen as it burned. Japanese commanders quickly realized that no amount of tactical ingenuity could mitigate the lethality of napalm. Trenches and bunkers that had withstood artillery were now rendered irrelevant. Production scale further emphasized the disparity. While Japanese industry struggled under the strain of Allied blockades, bombing raids, and resource shortages, American factories produced napalm in vast quantities. Thousands of canisters were deployed in coordinated waves, each one capable of incinerating entire forests or sections of defensive positions. The logistical coordination was equally impressive. Forward supply depots were stocked with napalm canisters, fuel trucks were secured for rapid distribution, and air crews were scheduled in tight rotations to maintain relentless pressure on Japanese positions. The combination of industrial output, chemical innovation, and tactical deployment created a force multiplier unmatched in the Pacific theater. The inventors and engineers behind napalm, many of whom worked under the War Research Service, were acutely aware of the strategic implications. Their work transcended laboratory calculations. It was intended to redefine jungle warfare. Reports indicate that chemists conducted field tests in remote areas, observing burn patterns across various types of foliage, humidity levels, and terrain slopes. Data from these tests informed both the chemical composition and delivery methods, ensuring that the weapon would perform reliably under combat conditions. The Americans also leveraged technical intelligence to refine deployment. Reconnaissance units provided maps and aerial photographs, identifying dense forest regions, natural choke points, and known Japanese fortifications. Forward observers would relay coordinates, allowing bombers to time releases with pinpoint accuracy. The resulting effect was almost surgical. Napalm struck precisely where planners intended, clearing corridors for advancing infantry while denying the enemy any possibility of retreat or regrouping. In Leyte, this meticulous approach manifested in devastating efficiency. During a coordinated strike, B-25s would make multiple passes, each dropping canisters in staggered intervals to sustain a continuous wave of fire. Ground troops, trained to anticipate the pattern, followed behind, seizing cleared positions before Japanese forces could mount an effective defense. Observers later noted the horrifying clarity with which the jungle was transformed. Areas that had teemed with life and activity were reduced to smoldering blackened corridors, as if the forest itself had been erased. The technical specifications of napalm delivery systems further illustrate the magnitude of the advantage. A single 75-gallon aerial bomb could cover an area of approximately 2,500 square feet, with ignition times calibrated to maximize adherence and burn duration. Portable flamethrowers, weighing upwards of 70 pounds with fuel, could project flames over 40 meters, capable of reaching into bunkers, caves, and dugouts. When combined, these systems created overlapping zones of fire that left Japanese units with virtually no safe refuge. Even Japanese countermeasures, such as pre-dug trenches or rudimentary fire breaks, were rendered ineffective. The sticky gel seeped into crevices, adhering to walls, foliage, and defensive structures, igniting them in a pattern that could not be anticipated. The heat alone was sufficient to collapse timber supports, destroy ammunition caches, and make previously secure positions untenable. Additionally, the durability of napalm allowed it to continue burning long after deployment, ensuring that advancing American forces encountered minimal resistance. The legacy of engineering excellence extended beyond mere battlefield success. It demonstrated the strategic value of integrating scientific innovation into operational doctrine. American military planners had transformed a chemical compound into a decisive tool of war, exploiting both the physical and psychological dimensions of combat. Japanese commanders, faced with this overwhelming technological advantage, were forced to adapt in desperation, often at great cost in men and material. The contrast between the two sides was stark. American forces, empowered by industrial output, chemical engineering, and tactical foresight, controlled the battlefield in ways previously unimaginable. Japanese soldiers, masters of jungle warfare for years, found their traditional advantages nullified by a weapon that was as much a product of meticulous engineering as it was of brute destructive power. In Leyte, the forests did not merely burn, they testified to the intersection of science, industry, and strategy. Napalm exemplified how innovation could tilt the balance of war, turning the natural landscape into a tool of offense and demonstrating that in modern warfare, understanding and exploiting technology could be as decisive as courage or numbers. The technical mastery behind napalm, therefore, was not merely a footnote in history. It was a pivotal factor that reshaped the Pacific Campaign, eroding the Japanese defensive edge and setting a precedent for how chemical and incendiary engineering would influence military strategy in conflicts to come. On October 20th, 1944, the beaches and jungles of Leyte became the stage for one of the most decisive demonstrations of American firepower in the Pacific. At dawn, the horizon shimmered with the silhouettes of landing craft cutting through the surf, their metal hulls glinting in the early light. Behind them, the roar of aircraft engines signaled the opening of a meticulously coordinated assault. Japanese forces had fortified the coastal approaches, establishing bunkers, trenches, and machine gun nests within the dense foliage. Observers counted artillery positions camouflaged beneath thick layers of leaves, anticipating a protracted engagement that would bleed the Americans as it had many others. Yet, the first wave of American airstrikes altered the battlefield dramatically. B-25 bombers, escorted by P-38s, executed low-level passes over the forested ridges, each aircraft releasing napalm canisters that cascaded in timed intervals. The incendiary gel spread across treetops and underbrush, igniting a roaring wall of orange that consumed entire defensive sectors. Soldiers entrenched in bunkers experienced the surreal terror of flames erupting around them, smoke choking their vision, and heat that warped the very air. Panic rippled through the Japanese ranks as units attempted to retreat or reorganize, only to find paths blocked by fire or be subjected to strafing runs from low-flying fighters. The tactical precision was astonishing. Forward observers on the ground had guided the aerial units to specific coordinates, creating corridors that allowed infantry to advance while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. The napalm struck in waves, each one designed to clear, suppress, and isolate pockets of resistance. Japanese counterattacks faltered almost immediately. Soldiers who attempted to move were engulfed by fire or cut down by machine guns trained on the only viable avenues of escape. Casualty figures illustrate the impact. Entire companies were rendered combat ineffective within hours. Bunkers that had withstood artillery were reduced to charred husks. Intercepted communications captured the shock and disbelief of Japanese commanders. Entire sectors burned in minutes. Our positions vanished. We cannot regroup. These messages reveal the depth of tactical disruption caused by napalm. The destruction was not indiscriminate chaos. It was a calculated dismantling of defensive networks. Engineers and planners had studied Japanese positions extensively, identifying choke points, supply routes, and fallback positions. Napalm strikes targeted these critical nodes, ensuring that the psychological and operational effects were compounded. Japanese soldiers were not only facing physical destruction but also a complete collapse of command and cohesion. Infantry units moving through cleared corridors reported an almost eerie calm amid the devastation, as if the forest itself had been neutralized as a threat. The combination of aerial assault, incendiary strikes, and synchronized infantry maneuvers created an operational tempo that Japanese forces could not match. Commanders struggled to issue orders across fractured lines of communication, while American units exploited every breach, consolidating gains rapidly and advancing deeper into the interior of the island. The scale of the operation was staggering. Thousands of troops participated, supported by hundreds of aircraft, artillery batteries, and armored vehicles adapted for jungle terrain. Every element of the assault was integrated with the incendiary campaign, highlighting the synergy between technological innovation and tactical doctrine. The effectiveness of napalm in this context was clear. Positions that would have taken days or weeks to neutralize through conventional means were destroyed in hours. Japanese defensive doctrine, which relied heavily on camouflage, entrenchment, and knowledge of the terrain, was rendered obsolete. The forested sanctuaries that had allowed for ambushes, flanking maneuvers, and strategic withdrawal were eradicated, leaving soldiers exposed and vulnerable. Accounts from surviving Japanese troops describe the surreal horror of advancing flames consuming everything they had relied upon. Trees splintered, bunkers ignited, and smoke blanketing entire valleys. The cacophony of battle, explosions, gunfire, aircraft engines, and the roar of fire overwhelmed the senses. Attempts at counteraction, such as deploying sandbags or digging new trenches, were futile against a weapon designed to adhere, burn, and spread uncontrollably. Within hours, entire regiments reported catastrophic losses. The initial shock translated into disorganized retreats as small groups attempted to escape the Inferno. American forces capitalized on the confusion, capturing positions with minimal resistance. Subsequent reconnaissance revealed the scale of devastation. Forests flattened into smoldering corridors, supply caches destroyed, and defensive networks dismantled. The psychological dimension of the engagement cannot be overstated. Japanese soldiers, many of whom had endured years of brutal jungle warfare, were confronted with a weapon and tactic they could not predict, counter, or endure. The sense of vulnerability extended beyond physical threat. It struck at the core of morale and confidence. Unit cohesion faltered as soldiers witnessed entire comrades and positions vanish in flames. Commanders were unable to maintain control, and strategic calculations were rendered meaningless amid the chaotic, fiery landscape. Reports filed after the battle underscore the operational success achieved through technological and tactical innovation. Air-ground coordination ensured that napalm strikes maximized impact, creating a chain reaction of destruction and confusion. Infantry units advanced through cleared corridors, facing minimal opposition, while Japanese forces struggled to regroup. The result was a decisive foothold for American troops on Leyte, paving the way for subsequent operations across the island and the eventual liberation of the Philippines. Equally significant was the demonstration of adaptability. American forces had learned from previous island campaigns, incorporating lessons regarding terrain, enemy tactics, and the integration of emerging technologies. Napalm, previously tested in isolated scenarios, was deployed at scale with precise timing and coordination, ensuring that its psychological and physical effects were fully exploited. The Japanese realization of this hidden advantage came too late. By the time the units attempted to establish fallback positions, the environment had been fundamentally altered. Traditional jungle warfare techniques, ambush, concealment, and entrenchment, were neutralized, leaving soldiers exposed to fire, infantry, and coordinated artillery. Even seasoned officers admitted the unprecedented scale of destruction and the futility of conventional defensive responses. After-action reports reflect the near disbelief of Japanese command. Entire defensive networks neutralized without prolonged engagements. Strategic positions consumed in moments, and troop morale shattered by the relentless advance of fire. The Leyte engagement thus stands as a case study in the transformative power of technology integrated with tactical foresight. Napalm, deployed with precision and backed by disciplined infantry and air units, redefined the possibilities of jungle warfare. The combination of physical devastation, psychological disruption, and operational efficiency exemplified a new paradigm in combat, one in which the battlefield itself could be manipulated as a weapon and where an enemy's environment, once an advantage, became a conduit for destruction. In the end, Leyte demonstrated the lethal calculus of modern war. American forces advanced with calculated precision, exploiting the Japanese inability to adapt to a radically altered battlefield. Napalm did not merely clear forests. It cleared paths for victory, reshaped strategic calculations, and etched into memory the terrifying reality that technological innovation, when combined with meticulous planning, could overwhelm even the most entrenched and disciplined defenders. By nightfall, the island bore the scars of a day's strategic orchestration, smoldering tree liens, shattered bunkers, and a Japanese defense rendered ineffective. For historians and military analysts, Leyte provided a stark illustration of how a single innovation, fully integrated into combined arms operations, could decisively alter the outcome of battle, tipping the scales in favor of a technologically and operationally superior force. The strategic and psychological repercussions of the Leyte Napalm campaign reverberated far beyond the immediate battlefield, reshaping the course of operations in the Philippines and forcing Japanese command to confront a new reality in jungle warfare. The Americans' ability to clear forests with calculated precision created not only physical corridors for advancement, but also an invisible stranglehold on morale. Japanese units, long accustomed to exploiting terrain for concealment, were now acutely aware that the environment itself could betray them. Every tree, every thicket, every ridge that had once offered protection now represented potential exposure to devastating fire. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion as troops experienced repeated psychological shocks. Small squads were decimated, lines of retreat were obliterated, and panic spread faster than the advancing flames. Reports intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed the depth of confusion. Officers lamented the breakdown of unit integrity. Soldiers questioned the effectiveness of entrenched positions, and entire regiments faced surrender or annihilation under the relentless pressure of combined arms tactics. The operational impact was immediate. By removing natural cover and neutralizing entrenched positions, napalm allowed American forces to maintain momentum at a pace the Japanese could not match. Infantry units moved through cleared corridors with minimal opposition, supported by artillery and airstrikes that compounded the sense of inevitability. This synchronization of firepower and maneuver demonstrated the strategic value of integrated technological innovation. It forced the enemy into reactive positions, dictated the tempo of engagement, and minimized the operational risk to advancing forces. Japanese commanders attempted to adapt. They redeployed units to less vulnerable areas, dug deeper trenches, and sought natural fire breaks in terrain they had previously considered unsuitable for defense. Yet, the psychological toll was profound. Soldiers hesitated, aware that any position could be struck without warning. Coordination faltered, as fear replaced initiative, and traditional doctrine, reliant on disciplined maneuver and terrain mastery, failed under the unpredictable and devastating influence of napalm. The Americans, conversely, capitalized on the emerging psychological edge. Troops advanced with confidence, knowing that the jungle no longer provided concealment for the enemy. The visual impact of entire forests vanishing ahead of their movement reinforced a sense of control and superiority, allowing units to execute maneuvers with precision and reduced casualties. Leadership at the tactical and operational levels reinforced this advantage. Officers coordinated with forward observers and air support, timing strikes to maintain continuous pressure on the Japanese while preserving avenues for American movement. Soldiers understood that the weapon was not only destructive but also strategically liberating, clearing paths and exposing positions that would have previously required costly engagements. On a broader strategic scale, the psychological impact extended beyond individual battles. Japanese forces faced an existential challenge in defending islands across the Philippines. The knowledge that forests could be incinerated, bunkers rendered obsolete, and entrenched positions neutralized undermined confidence in broader operational plans. Retreats became more chaotic, defensive lines were harder to hold, and morale deteriorated as soldiers recognized the futility of conventional resistance in the face of a technologically superior and psychologically relentless adversary. Field reports highlight this transformation. Japanese troops reported, "The forest itself betrays us," a statement underscoring the depth of shock induced by a weapon that turned their most reliable defensive advantage into a liability. The combination of physical destruction and psychological pressure created an operational environment where the Americans dictated every engagement, choosing when and where to strike while the Japanese reacted defensively, often with catastrophic consequences. The consequences of this psychological edge were amplified by the Americans' logistical and communications superiority. Coordinated radio networks allowed for rapid adjustment of tactics, immediate targeting of vulnerable positions, and real-time support for advancing units. In contrast, Japanese communication lines were disrupted by the chaos of battle, the loss of terrain, and the unpredictable spread of fire. Isolated units could not coordinate effectively, further eroding morale and operational effectiveness. The cumulative effect of these factors was decisive. The psychological warfare component, enabled by napalm and integrated with tactical innovation, forced Japanese soldiers into reactive, vulnerable postures, while American troops leveraged momentum and technological advantage to press attacks with precision. Casualties mounted disproportionately on the Japanese side, as fear and disorientation magnified the lethal effectiveness of the strikes. Strategically, the ability to control the battlefield through fire-reshaped campaign planning. American commanders could allocate fewer resources to neutralizing entrenched positions, confident that napalm would clear obstacles and expose hidden forces. Operations became faster, more coordinated, and less costly in manpower, allowing the Allies to advance through Leyte more rapidly than Japanese defenders anticipated. The psychological dimension extended to leadership perception as well. Japanese officers, many of whom had prided themselves on jungle warfare expertise, were forced to acknowledge the obsolescence of traditional doctrines. Diaries and intercepted communications convey shock, disbelief, and a sense of inevitability. Conventional tactics could not counter a weapon that manipulated terrain itself, leaving them reactive and vulnerable. The contrast with American forces was stark. Confidence, initiative, and technological integration reinforced operational dominance. Troops moved through previously impenetrable forests with security and purpose, knowing that enemy cover had been neutralized. The resulting morale boost, combined with reduced casualties and increased operational tempo, amplified the strategic advantage gained through napalm. The psychological toll on Japanese forces extended beyond immediate engagements. News of repeated losses and forest-clearing strikes spread rapidly among units, creating a pervasive sense of vulnerability and inevitability. Soldiers approached positions with trepidation, anticipating incineration rather than combat, and the fear of fire became a dominant factor in operational decision-making. Commanders found themselves constrained by the limitations imposed by panic and disorientation, further diminishing strategic options and increasing reliance on defensive retreats or surrender. The effectiveness of napalm in shaping both physical and psychological aspects of the battlefield thus exemplified a new paradigm of modern warfare, one in which control over terrain, perception, and morale could be as decisive as firepower alone. By dominating both the environment and the mind, American forces redefined engagement strategies, forcing defenders into untenable positions while minimizing risks to their own units. The broader lessons were clear. The integration of technological innovation, precise coordination, and psychological awareness created a force multiplier that reshaped operational outcomes. Japanese troops, faced with the dual reality of physical destruction and mental pressure, were unable to adapt effectively, leading to cascading failures in defense, command, and morale. Leyte demonstrated that in modern warfare, the battlefield was no longer solely a contest of arms and numbers. Control over perception, environment, and timing could decisively tilt engagements in favor of the technologically and operationally superior force. Napalm was not merely a weapon of fire. It was a weapon of influence, shaping decisions, dictating movements, and undermining enemy cohesion long before direct confrontation. The campaign underscored the psychological dimension of technological advantage. That mastery over the battlefield's physical and mental landscape could produce outcomes disproportionate to numerical strength, forcing defenders into reactive postures, and ensuring that victory was not only tactical but inevitable. The legacy of Napalm and Leyte extended far beyond the immediate tactical and operational victories of October 1944, influencing not only the outcome of the Pacific Campaign, but also the evolution of modern warfare. In the aftermath of the Leyte landings, Japanese defensive doctrine was forced into a reevaluation. Commanders confronted a sobering reality. Terrain, once a fortress, could no longer guarantee protection, and entrenched positions offered diminishing returns against a technologically adept and strategically innovative adversary. The destruction of forests and bunkers, achieved with precise, coordinated napalm strikes, became a defining lesson in the importance of adapting to new weapons and tactics. For American military planners, the success of Leyte validated an operational philosophy that prioritized integration, adaptability, and innovation. Napalm had proven that the effective combination of chemistry, engineering, and tactical foresight could manipulate the environment itself, transforming the jungle from an obstacle into an instrument of offensive dominance. This principle would inform subsequent operations across the Philippines, in Okinawa, and ultimately in planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Beyond the immediate theater, the psychological and strategic implications of napalm were studied extensively in post-war analyses. Military scholars and tacticians examined the manner in which terrain, morale, and firepower could be orchestrated to achieve decisive outcomes. The lessons learned informed Cold War doctrines, particularly in scenarios involving dense terrain, unconventional defenses, and the necessity of controlling both the environment and the opponent's perception. Napalm's effectiveness at Leyte also presaged the development of network-centric approaches to warfare, where coordination between ground, air, and logistical units could amplify the impact of individual weapons. American forces recognized that technological superiority alone was insufficient. Victory required precise execution, timing, and the ability to exploit innovations within a larger operational framework. The industrial and scientific achievements underpinning napalm production became a model for integrating research, development, and deployment in future conflicts. Factories capable of mass-producing incendiaries and other advanced munitions demonstrated the critical importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare. Engineers, chemists, and logistics personnel were acknowledged as essential components of military strategy, their work transforming abstract innovation into battlefield dominance. The psychological dimension of Leyte further reinforced the understanding that modern combat extended beyond bullets and bombs. Morale, perception of invulnerability, and the fear induced by an unpredictable environment could decisively shape outcomes. The Japanese experience highlighted the devastating consequences when soldiers' expectations of terrain and defensive advantage were systematically undermined. These lessons influenced not only military planners, but also historians and educators, emphasizing the necessity of integrating mental and physical dimensions of warfare in both training and operational planning. In subsequent conflicts, from the Korean War to Vietnam and beyond, the principles demonstrated at Leyte, control of terrain, psychological disruption, and integration of technology with doctrine, became central to operational planning. Incendiary weapons, combined arms coordination, and rapid adaptability were recognized as force multipliers capable of compensating for numerical disadvantages or challenging terrain. For soldiers on Leyte, the experience left an indelible mark. The visual memory of forests consumed in waves of fire, the sound of crackling underbrush, and the realization that traditional jungle fortifications could be rendered ineffective shaped training, tactics, and expectations for generations of American military personnel. The lessons were stark and enduring. Innovation, integration, and adaptability could decisively overcome entrenched defensive expertise, and the battlefield itself could be wielded as a weapon. Japanese forces, in turn, internalized the consequences of failing to adapt. Doctrine, previously centered on terrain mastery and entrenched defense, had to evolve in response to the stark realities of technological disruption. Commanders recognized that conventional wisdom, however deeply ingrained, could be rendered obsolete by rapid advances in firepower, chemical engineering, and operational coordination. The strategic calculus of warfare shifted permanently. Leyte exemplified the principle that control over both environment and perception could determine outcomes as effectively as sheer numbers or firepower. Modern military theorists cite the campaign as a pivotal moment in the evolution of networked and technology-driven warfare, where speed, coordination, and psychological dominance can outweigh traditional advantages. In reflecting upon the Leyte campaign, a universal lesson emerges: connection, coordination, and innovation dictate the rhythm and outcome of conflict. The Japanese reliance on terrain and entrenched positions, once considered formidable, proved insufficient against a force that integrated engineering, tactics, and psychological strategy into a cohesive system. American success was not the result of isolated technological superiority, but of the meticulous orchestration of tools, terrain, and timing. Napalm, as employed in Leyte, became emblematic of this philosophy, a weapon that was not only destructive but transformative, reshaping the battlefield and redefining the parameters of modern war. The campaign also underscored the broader principle that warfare is as much about perception as it is about firepower. By demonstrating the ability to dominate both the physical environment and the enemy's psychological state, American forces established a template for future operations, highlighting the enduring importance of innovation, coordination, and adaptability. When post-war assessments were conducted, military analysts noted that the lessons of Leyte transcended the Pacific theater. The principles of combined arms integration, technological application, and battlefield manipulation informed doctrine in Europe, Asia, and later conflicts where terrain, fortifications, and morale played decisive roles. Modern network-centric warfare, precision strike capabilities, and psychological operations can trace conceptual lineage to the methods perfected during the Leyte campaign. Ultimately, Leyte offered a stark, visceral demonstration of how the integration of technology, strategy, and psychology could redefine combat. The forests that Japanese soldiers had relied upon for concealment became a testament to innovation's decisive edge. Entire defensive networks were neutralized, morale shattered, and tactical assumptions overturned. In modern military thought, Leyte remains a case study in the transformative power of calculated, integrated innovation, where victory is achieved not merely by force, but by the orchestration of all elements of warfare: technology, terrain, timing, and the human psyche. The final, enduring lesson resonates with clarity. In war, as in strategy, connection outweighs brute force. Foresight surpasses instinct, and the ability to shape the battlefield, physically and psychologically, determines the ultimate victor. The Japanese soldiers' disbelief at the destruction wrought by napalm encapsulates the broader truth of the campaign: mastery of the environment, innovative application of technology, and strategic integration are decisive. Leyte stands as a reminder that modern warfare is not static. It evolves with ingenuity, precision, and the relentless pursuit of advantage, and that in such a contest, adaptation and coordination are the weapons that endure beyond the battlefield.